Good afternoon, everyone. We are so excited to have you here for our Theological Day of Reflection Part 2. Um, my name is Rolanda Ward, and I'm a social work professor here at Niagara University. I'm also the endowed faculty director of the Bente Ostapenko Center for Race, Equity, and Mission. It is certainly my pleasure to welcome you today. The Ostapenko Center is a place here on our campus where we initiate conversations and dialogue about racial equity. Our purpose is to create conversations and to disseminate current insights about what we all need to be thinking about with respect to racial equity. Our work brings together students, faculty members, staff, and community members, both locally as well as nationally, represented by your presence here today. We know that you will find today's program intellectually stimulating as well as action promoting. And so at this time, I would like to ask Father Aidan Rudy, CM, Vice President of Mission Integration here at Niagara University, to extend a very warm welcome to you all.
Good afternoon. As a Catholic and Vincentian University, we've undertaken the work of identifying and dismantling racism in our own institution, even as we continue the work of educating advocates for social change. Guided by three principles of Catholic social teaching. One, the inviolability of the life and dignity of the human person. Two, the privileged position of the impoverished and marginalized, which echoes the deepest principles of the Vincentian charism. And three, the fundamental right of human participation in the promotion of and contribution to the common good. Niagara University is impelled by St. Vincent de Paul's counsel that all of our study, analysis, prayer, reflection, research, and teaching must end up in action. As our president, Father Marr, so commonly quotes the classic dictum, totum opus nostrum in operatione consistit. To put it simply, Niagara must be anti-racist. Only then will our principal task as an institution to provide a witness and proclamation of the gospel of Jesus that all may know God prove credible. We know we're not alone as a Catholic institution or even as an institution of higher education in the United States. Niagara University is a binational institution with, in fact, global reach. So we're happy to see people from across the world logged in today. And so on behalf of Father Marr and the entire Niagara University community, welcome Dr. Gibson, welcome all. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Rooney, for that very warm welcome. I hope that you all feel our sense of hospitality no matter where you are today. Today's speaker, Reverend Dr. Danjuma Gibson, is a professor, and he is the professor of pastoral care at Calvin Theological Seminary. And he is in private practice as a psychotherapist in Grand Rapids, Michigan. His most recent book, Frederick Douglass, A Psychobiography, Rethinking Subjectivity in the Western Experiment of Democracy, is an investigation into the formation of Douglass's psychological and religious identity in the context of trauma and the American slavocracy. In addition to psychological trauma, Dr. Gibson's current research includes exploring the intersection of urbanism, Black religious experience, psychoanalytic discourse, and social economic influences. Dr. Gibson earned his Bachelor of Arts from Morehouse, a Master's of Business Administration from DePaul University, a Master's in Urban Ministry, and a Master's of Christian Studies from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and a Doctor of Philosophy from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. I am tired of reading all of these degrees. He holds memberships in the American Academy of Religion, the Society of Pastoral Theology, the Society for the Study of Black Religion, and the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education. As Dr. Gibson speaks, please post your questions in the chat. I will moderate the chat and will ask your questions as he speaks. please remain muted throughout. We are so delighted to have you here, Dr. Gibson, and we welcome you to Niagara University, even though it's virtually today. Please unmute yourself and share some thoughts with us all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ward, and many thanks to the Niagara community for having me here today. Certainly wish it could be in person, but we all understand the Zoom days that we are in. And so I'm grateful to be here and grateful for all of you who are joining us today online. I'm grateful to see so many faces, and I'll touch on that briefly. From the time Dr. Ward is aware that we were able to be together a couple of years ago. So many of our friends are online here as well. When we met back here in Grand Rapids for our summer workshop. But today I want to just talk to you about my current research project that really is steeped in what we are experiencing today. And you'll see there in the title of this conversation, we are talking about demythologizing certain historical figures so that we can rethink how we engage theological praxis. I think Father Rooney began when he talked about how action is so important when we think about the work around anti-racism and the work around freedom, the work around justice. And so similar to how I will start is basically just to outline briefly the gist of the project. And then I'm going to back up and sort of go through a timeline, the same timeline you've experienced in this country as well, to show how our experiences over the last 2 years are really informing this project. But basically, this project is somewhat similar to the work I did with Frederick Douglass, which was a psychobiography of his autobiographies. Similarly, I am taking a psychobiographic look at several African-American, several Black historical personalities. And many times we refer to them as individuals who were activists, individuals who were in the civil rights movement. But in this project, I want to demythologize them, because when we idealize these individuals, people such as Ida B. Wells, Martin Luther King, Frederick Douglass, Howard Thurman, Fannie Lou Hamer, when we idealize them, we are superimposing upon them, in some respects, superhuman qualities. And when we do that, at the same time, we are able, whether we are doing it consciously or unconsciously, we are able to come up with excuses as to why we cannot do the work that they were doing. And so while, yes, they may have, I will say, at least in this talk, they may have appeared to be activists. They may have appeared to be civil rights activists or workers, however history defines them. In this project, I am making the argument that they were people. They were people like you and I. Many of them, such as, I'll just take an example, one of the most famous names here, Martin Luther King. If you look at the body of his work, many students, I find, fail to realize that he was a theologian. They are unfamiliar with the tens of thousands of pages that he has written from a theological perspective in the sermons. But he didn't want to do what he was doing. He wanted to be a pastor and periodically an adjunct professor. You could say the same for many of those names that I called out, yet they responded to the call. So in this project, I'm trying to develop a clinical picture so that we can take a look at that and say, how can we do the same thing today? So when we idealize, idealization, romanticizing, when I say idealize, I'm really talking more about how we superimpose these sort of fantastic capabilities or superhuman capabilities upon people. When I say romanticize, I'm talking more about a specific period. All of us idealize. Psychology tells us now, in some ways, just like a child may idealize their parent, they may say, my father's really strong, my mother is this. We idealize as a way to comfort ourselves when we lack the capacity to idealize or to form ideas. And so we like to idealize people, and then we associate with them as a way to calm the anxiety in our own self until we are able to form the same ideas, until we develop the maturity and the capacity to do that. So arguably, over the entire lifespan, we are idealizing people. Sometimes we idealize institutions. But idealization and romanticizing over the long run, it blinds us, it deludes us, it corrupts us, it has the potential to corrupt us. We are living in a day where the talk of race, while admirable, I fear in some respects, the talk of race and the talk of anti-racism is becoming hip for consumer consumption. It's to say that I saw this movie or I read this book, or did you see this, or did you see that? In some ways, it's becoming a part of the cool kids club. You know, again, this is the idea behind idealization. It makes me think that if I read the book or if I saw the movie, then I'm a part of the movement. But then I began to ask myself over the last couple of years, what is being said today that already hasn't been said decades ago by Black and brown scholars? And I would argue very little, if at all, is being said today that hasn't already been said. Whether we're talking about Toni Morrison, whether we are talking about James Baldwin, whether we are talking about other Black and brown theologians, scholars, historians. So the consumption, I'm afraid here that the consumption of Black and brown suffering for the sake of Black and brown suffering, it borders on what I refer to, and some of you may know I use this term sometimes, it borders on what I refer to as racial pornography, the pornographic. And it's the pornographic that runs the risk of us becoming relational refugees with each other, because the gaze and the infatuation on Black and brown suffering runs the risk of making us believe that we have formed relationships, but hiding the fact that we are really not relational people. We just like to watch, and we like to get the thrill out of watching. Sometimes I'll refer to it as forgiveness pornography, where we like to see others who are oppressed. We get a thrill out of seeing them forgive the oppressor, but we ourselves have no intention of changing our ways or the systems of oppression that we are benefiting from. To watch, but to do nothing to alleviate the suffering, that's what makes watching pornographic. And so as I was thinking about this, I thought about the classic poem / song, Lift Every Voice and Sing. And there's a verse in there, this song you may be familiar with, by James Weldon Johnson. He was the poet. His brother, John Johnson, put the music to it. But I'll turn your attention to the second verse. And I've thought a lot about this second verse on and off the past couple of years. It says, stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed. Watch this. He says, we have come over a way that with tears have been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. Now I have to tell you, as I listened to this, it even served as conviction for me. And I had to ask myself over the last several years, what are you doing scholarship for? Are you doing scholarship to be well accepted by those in peer review, to be well accepted by the academy? Or are you doing scholarship for those who are suffering and fighters for freedom? Are you doing scholarship for the work of the kingdom? Or are you doing scholarship for the sake of being published? You can be published, and at the same time, you can win the praise of the academy, and that same work can mean absolutely nothing for the community you are trying to serve. So, how do I get here? How did I get here? A couple of years ago, Dr. Ward is familiar with this. We had a workshop, a summer-long workshop. Many of our beautiful friends, Dr. Ward, are here online. They remember the time. It was a workshop on how we can use Black spiritual autobiographies in our work in the church and in ministry. And several months after that workshop, I thought, okay, I can just write a book. It'll come out pretty quickly, just take some of my workshop notes and just talk about some of the topics we talked about. It was some of our conversations. And so that was the original plan. And then if you can move through the last couple of years with me, we get to the summer of 2020, and we have this brutal public murder, this public lynching of George Floyd. Now, some of you may, in your various places of work, your various communities, some of you are in predominantly white institutions. It was not until last year that I understood Du Bois in his work, The Souls of Black Folk. He starts off by saying, in giving an analogy, but he poses a question. He says, what does it feel like to be a problem? And that, the murder of George Floyd, it shook a conversation around our country. But in that moment, you knew what it was. You felt, if you were a person of color, you felt your Blackness. And whether you were in the store, whether you were in the community, whether you were with friends, you knew that somehow your very body would prompt a conversation, many times of which a conversation people didn't want to have. But your very existence would prompt the conversation. And many people looked at, the trial has occurred, it's transpired. Many people looked at the faces of the police officers, the face of Derek Chauvin, and they would talk about, it's a look of evil. I never thought it was a look of evil. I thought it was something more sinister. It was the look of banality. That's a term that we see Hannah Arendt uses in her work. And when I say banality, I mean this. It was the look of normality. It was the same look as if you were to walk into the grocery store and you were looking at the aisle of cereal and you were saying, I have no idea what I'm going to choose. It was a look of normalcy. In the same year, you have individuals, Ahmaud Arbery, running, and he's all of a sudden, he's jogging through the neighborhood, and all of a sudden he's accosted. His life is taken because it is thought he poses a danger. Just the year before, you have Botham Jean. We forget about this. In his own home, a police officer mistakes his apartment for her apartment, and his life is no more. You have Breonna Taylor. I mean, the list goes on. Many people forget about a Tatiana Jefferson, who was in her home in Fort Worth in October 2019 and killed in her own home as she shot from the outside by a law enforcement officer because it was thought she was an intruder in her own home. So I have grave concerns here. As I was working up through this project, it began to change, or the telos of it. We are becoming too familiar with and too normalized to violence. Then even here in my own state, armed protesters march on the state capitol. There's relative silence about that now in the church. Now, that's not to say could any church at any particular place, I'm just making a general observation, could they have spoken about it? But you did not hear an outrage. Then after that, a plot is uncovered to kidnap the governor of Michigan. You do not hear a lot of outrage about that. And then this year, I am sitting on my couch waiting for my family to come home on a normal day. And I am seeing before my very eyes a riot unfold in the nation's capital. And I'm gripped with fear because I'm wondering, where is the bottom of this? Where is this going to stop? What is next? Where are the authorities? I'm going to come back to that in a moment. I invite you to a brief psychoanalytic exercise with me. Sometimes I may do this in my private practice in various situations. Imagine where you were in November or December of last year. And ask yourself, in November or December of last year, could you have imagined that January 6th would happen? Probably most of us would say we couldn't have imagined that in November or December. So my question is this: what is it now that we are not imagining? Throughout that last, or throughout that timeline, we are increasing the ante for the toleration of violence. And we are becoming immune and indifferent to what is happening before us. And I argue that that is a very, very dangerous game. It is a very dangerous place that we find ourselves in. I make that case from a pastoral theological perspective, from a practical theological perspective. This is dangerous what we are doing as a society. So in this current project, what I am hoping that I can do is, if I can demythologize those freedom fighters, those theologians, those church people, the people that were normal, we have been here before. They have shown us a way out, but we have to do the work of demythologizing them so that we, instead of us standing on the outside of history, we can now involve ourselves in history and begin to do the work of the kingdom. I don't see any questions, Dr. Ward, so I'm going to keep going here.
There were a couple, Dr. Gibson. One of the questions asked, are Black churches doing enough with respect to oppression? And then a second person is asking if you have examples of folks who are putting scholarship out, but there's no action tied to it.
To the second one, I would argue, I won't call out specific names because I don't think the observation is not about a specific name. It's more about what I would suggest is scholarly methodology or theological method. Many times we engage in what I call disembodied theology, where after we are done, there is no ethical mandate for action. Another way I look at this biblically is after we are done with whatever theologizing we are doing, the next question, and I think practical theology demands this, the next question is, how then do your words become flesh and dwell among men? This is the same thing we see with Jesus in the first chapter of John. The word becomes flesh. So the question is always, how does our scholarship become flesh, and how does it dwell among humankind? I would make the argument that many scholars, if not all of us, to some degree, more or less, we are guilty of that. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, how is your work? And when we think about theological education, far too often we are simply, we bracket off the talk of racism. We talk about race as if it is a particular category. My position is this: there is not one discipline in the Theological Academy that is exempt from the responsibility of talking about racial hatred and love for our fellow brother. I don't care if it's systematics. I don't care if it's theological ethics. It could be New Testament, Old Testament, practical theology, pastoral theology. I don't care if you are simply in a Hebrew class or a Greek class, learning the verbs, learning the language. There is nothing in theological education and in scholarship that is exempt from the task of how does our work contribute to love of God, and then next, love of neighbor.
Dr. Gibson, there's one question that I think is also tied to that. Tamisha is asking the question, what do you mean when you say the word activist? Can you just describe that a little bit more?
Yeah, I am using the word as I perceive it has been used when people, it's really a catchy word. It generally denotes someone, you imagine someone that's so in love with doing social work that they give their life to it. And these are people who have, again, I'm talking about an idealized imagination. And there could be people like that who've given their lives to it, make no mistake, to a particular social cause, to rally the conscience of a nation, to rally the conscience of a community. I have no problem with that. However, the danger is if I don't call myself an activist, it makes me think that I am exempt from the activities and the responsibilities that activists have given their life to, or let's say professional activists. In this work, however, I am making the argument, whether we're talking about a Fannie Lou Hamer, whether we're talking about a Martin Luther King, if I can use the word, these individuals did not wake up with an aspiration. Neither at a point in their life did they decide, I want to be a professional activist. Through love, in this project, what I call transgressive love, they were responding to the suffering of the communities they were serving. And their actions was not based on a desire to be a professional activist. Their actions were based on their love for their brother and sister. And to the question of, do I think the Black church is doing enough? Again, that's a very general question. When we say Black church, we have to be careful because that tends to be a catch-all phrase, especially in higher education. However, if we have time, as I get to my definition of, how we need to redefine our concept of racism, I think the question is whether we're talking about a Black or brown church, whether we are talking about a white church, the question is not, am I a racist or not? In this country, with 400 plus years, the question, the more diagnostic question is, to what extent have I been affected by the racial imagination? To what extent have I been affected by the racial imagination? Or to what extent in Black and brown communities have I internalized it? It is very difficult to make the argument that you can be born and raised in the United States, enculturated and socialized in our society, and to make a case, to be educated in the United States, to go to church in the United States, to be a part of a religious organization or a religious tradition in the United States, and to make the claim, I am not affected by racial ideology or the racial imagination. I think that's the more important question for any church.
Dr. Gibson, one more question before
Sure.
you dive into the rest of it. So our friend Karen is asking the question, what are your thoughts about reimagining reimagination of integration? So what does that look like?
I am not sure that I understand the question fully, the reimagination of integration. But I will say this. I'll try to respond. I think the theological purposes of integration have always been misunderstood. Integration has generally been understood as, historically, doing favors for an oppressed community and letting them be with us, allowing them to come along. When in actuality, a theology of integration really reflects, I believe, what we see on Pentecost. And that is, you are deluded to think that any one culture, you are deluded to think that the dominant culture can fully represent the vastness of the Godhead. And secondly, from a theological anthropology perspective, we are deluded to think that one culture or one ethnicity can fully communicate what it means to be human. And so what we see on the day of Pentecost is that there was divine disclosure directly. God communicated directly to supposedly every person under the sun at that particular time, and each person heard their language, and in their language, they heard the wonderful works of God. Now, what does that mean? I don't know your language. That means if I want to know a little bit more about God, I have to talk to and be in relationship with someone who is not like me. Integration has been always posited in terms of let's do favors for other people. COVID has turned it on its head, because COVID has revealed to the whole world, in order for you to make it out of this, you need everyone to cooperate. If we think we can get out of this and not help India out, we don't understand the theology of integration. COVID has disrupted the fallacy of class, thinking that somehow you were better than others who made less, the fallacy of gender, the fallacy of gender identity or sexuality. We need everyone working together to make this happen. I'm sorry, that was a long-winded response to a question about integration, but I think it's more about how do we understand the theology of integration?
Just one last question, and then you can dive into your next section. So Deborah is asking the question, Kendi often talks about an activist produces power and policy change and not mental change. What are your thoughts about that?
My thoughts is that I commend Kendi. He is coming out of his, he's coming out of how he is trained. He is coming out of, the space where he is doing work. And so I definitely understand the things about policy change, that you need that. You need that. I am a practical theologian. And one of the arguments I make towards the end of this project, the end of this book that I am working on, is what I call a concept nitty-gritty discipleship. One of how we have romanticized the civil rights movement, we think that it started from the top. It started from tens of thousands of people simply connecting with the one or two people in their sphere of influence that over time created a mass movement. And I think there are pneumatological implications here when we talk about the Holy Spirit moving. Many times we think in our individual perspectives, the Holy Spirit moves, it's me individually. However, when we look in scripture, we see a move of the Spirit. It affects a plurality of individuals to move in a particular way. And so you need both. I mean, I think in many ways, this is a historical argument when we look at Thurgood Marshall, and he made similar claims about you have to change the law structurally. I totally agree. But then you had others who wanted to appeal, like Martin Luther King, to the conscience. And here's the thing about it. There is no immediate tangible evidence that you have done something, but you are constantly appealing to the conscience of the people that are on the ground. I'll come back to that. So I have no problem with the work that he's doing. I think it's wonderful. But there is no one work that is fully complete. And I think it needs to be expanded, and not necessarily by him, but there are others that in this generation of professionals, of scholars, of clergy women, that have to expand that analysis. Dr. Ward, do you want me to keep going here, or is there something else?
Yes, keep going.
So when I think of this project, I am doing this project at the intersection of pastoral theology, practical theology, psychohistory, and social psychology. I am doing this project, I'm imagining it at the intersection of pastoral theology. And why pastoral theology? This is important. When I talk about pastoral theology, I am talking about theological reflection on the care of souls in church, in the faith community. In this project, racial reconciliation is not my telos. Now that sounds inflammatory. I am concerned, however, that racial reconciliation has become a part of this consumerizing of how we talk about race. You can leave structures of oppression in place and be reconciled to someone else as long as you remove the tension out of the relationship. You can be reconciled and not talk about history. I fear that the talk of racial reconciliation is becoming a red herring conversation that shifts the attention away from a more fundamental issue, and that is our soul. The soul of America has been corrupted by racial hatred, and until we talk about pastoral care strategies to heal the corrupted soul, racial reconciliation will mean nothing. I'm arguing as the soul is healed, racial reconciliation will become more organic as it flows out of a healed soul. It will be more organic as opposed to right now, I would say it is more acquisitive to the conversation. But also, I'm doing this at the intersection of practical theology because I'm asking questions about the church's active role in perpetuating racial ideology. We cannot talk about race without talking about the church in this country. It cannot happen. And sort of the blind assumption to say that Christianity is the immediate antidote to racial hatred. It is turning a blind eye to the history of Christianity and how it has been a center of racist ideology and how it has perpetuated it. But I'm also looking at psychohistory because I'm making a case here that history is simply repeating itself. So we have hope. We have others. We have a great cloud of witnesses. The question, I think we've forgotten about that because of the ideology of progress. And we are afraid that if we look back, then we have to concede that this idea of progress is not what it is. That is what happened on January the 6th. So I'm looking at this, I'm doing this also from the perspective of psychohistory, because I'm looking at a spiritual and psychological profile. How did these other people we've mythologized as normal people, how did they do it? And how did we come through this as a nation? We've been here before. So I'm using psychohistory, but it's also at that intersection. It's a four-way intersection. I'm using social psychology because we need that to understand how do groups function? What is it that we are seeing here where our nation is so divided? Where you have some who are absolutely convinced with no evidence that the last election was a fraud. I use social psychology there. I'm sorry, Dr. Ward, were you saying something?
I was going to jump in because there are a couple questions in the chat that kind of relate to this a bit. And so one of the questions talked about evangelical and their decry of critical race theory. Also your perceptions of Black Lives Movement and Black Lives Matter movement. And then also too, the idea that some are saying that that social justice and biblical justice are contrary to one another. And so we have different viewpoints about what is justice and what is racial justice or not. Is it even something that we should be aspiring to? Can you say a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, so I'll start with the last one here. You may have to remind me of the other questions. To respond to this, I think of Howard Thurman's seminal text, Jesus and the Disinherited. And he asks a question at the beginning, and it's a rhetorical question. He says, what would Christianity be if we had not forgotten that the faith emanated out of an oppressed community? What would it be like 2,000 years later had we not forgotten about that? What would it be like had we not forgotten that it didn't emanate out of the power struggle? And this is probably what we see beginning with the time of Constantine. In my own work, I think a lot of those terms that you just mentioned, Dr. Ward, I think in some ways they have historical locations, but it is a form, I believe, this is my interpretation, of identity politics where we forget that Jesus was executed and murdered. I don't understand a gospel that doesn't speak to the suffering and the oppression of anyone. Now, I know we say social gospel, and that has a historical context. So there is a legitimate conversation to have about it. When you talk about things like critical race theory, that terminology, well, first, I am aware of the argument and my position on it, people saying that it's not consistent with Christianity. Whether you call it critical race theory or whether you call it something else, there have been plenty of Black and brown people talking about structures of evil in place. I just can't tolerate the argument that it's somehow non-Christian. It's just not hearable. How can you even look at the First Testament when you look at you look at Isaiah, you look at the prophets and they talk about the structures. They prophesy against the structures of oppression, the structures of kings in place. You go to the New Testament, the Second Testament, and Paul says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against rulers of darkness, against spiritual wickedness in high places. To suggest that somehow critical race theory, you can point to particular facets of it, as you can point to particular facets of theology, period. You can point to evangelical theology, you can point to Presbyterian theology, Methodist, Baptist. You can be from Barth, Tillich. You can point to anyone, a Reform hermeneutic, and point to where it falls short, because all theology comes from a particular location, and it comes from a particular location that includes human beings, and we are limited. This, I believe, is diametric. This is why a theology of Pentecost is so important, where we see that God is most fully revealed in the multiplicity of people. And I compare that to a theology, what we saw at the Tower of Babel, where everyone endeavored to speak the same language. And what did we see God say? That's dangerous, when everyone is talking the exact same thing. That's incredibly dangerous. And so what did God do? Wow, he confuses God confuses the languages. Critical race theory, whether you want to call it critical race theory, whether you want to call it structural racism, it speaks to structures that the collective have put in place over generations to keep subjugation and evil in place. And so whether you call it critical race theory, whether you call it something else, I think those arguments are beside the point. What is the essence of what those arguments are trying to say, what those arguments are trying to raise up, what those theories are trying to raise up? I think there was a question about Black Lives Matter.
It does, and I think it connects to what how you just ended. So for the Black Lives Matter, people don't take it seriously. And so what do you have to say about the movement and how it's related to what you just described regarding a theological perspective of justice?
What do I have to say about it? They do matter. And history shows that historically, they simply haven't mattered. I am saying, Dr. Ward, you and I can be in an argument till we turn blue in the face, saying we're not saying that white lives don't matter. I mean, we know that's not what it is saying. We are saying Black and brown lives matter just as much as white lives matter. Just as much. I think for me, the question is, and it's also a source of joy and excitement. Last year, when we saw this movement of young people coming out to protest the death of George Floyd, the locus wasn't the church. They didn't go to the church and say, what do you want us to do? Let's get your idea. To this very day, there's always this question and this observation that 11 o'clock, what do they say, is the most segregated hour. Guess what? Our children, the millennials that the church has debased for the last 12 years saying they don't love Jesus, they've left the church. Our children showed us how to do it overnight. You saw across the nation, Black, brown, Hispanic, Asian, they were marching saying, this is wrong and we will be heard. That's the church. The church was on the street. And the church followed that movement in whatever words it had to say. That just wasn't Black and brown people marching. You saw young white people, young white women, young white men, people from all backgrounds. For some reason, they didn't come together and have a problem with, okay, how do we reconcile our differences? There was something they understood and they were walking together overnight.
I think we've hit all the questions so far. So you can go ahead with your next section. And then we'll probably hear some of the voices. We'll ask a couple of people to unmute themselves so you can hear your friends.
About what time are we going up to again? About how much more time do we have?
So we have until 1:25. So,
okay. All right. My concern here is that we've increased our tolerance for racial violence. We're increasing our tolerance level by staying silent. And so a pastoral diagnosis, I'm arguing that we are mesmerized by violence and evil. Charles Tart, calls it the consensus trance, the sleep of everyday life. Jeffrey Means, he's another pastoral psychologist, argues that with the consensus trance, and he's referring to Charles Tart, he says, the only way that we generally awake out of the consensus trance is that something more violent has to happen. Here is my problem. That was over, I think, 15 years ago when Jeffrey Means wrote that. My point is, we are increasing our tolerance level so much through silence and indifference that we are mesmerized by this racial violence, and the prognosis is not good. In my first book on Frederick Douglass, I write, over time, it's the toleration of this type of violence. It's the toleration of racial evil, of slavery. It ossifies the soul of a nation. There is a price to pay. Sometimes when I teach human suffering and I talk about what's a theology of suffering, yes, the one who is injured and oppressed, they are obviously the injury to them is evident. However, those who watch and do nothing, there is also injury to the image of God inside of you. The ossification, it's the toleration of this. Over time, it ossifies our souls and it subverts the democratic principles. We become onlookers and bystanders, and it denigrates our internal moral compass. That is my concern as I went through that litany of we have these things. You have the things that happened here in Michigan. Then you have an attempted kidnapping. And then you have this thing in Washington. You have these mass shootings. On and on. There's an increasing level of racial or nationalistic oriented violence that we are incorporating into our psyche and into our soul. And that is dangerous. So if we don't change this, I am arguing that we are probably looking at a 21st century manifestation of the redemption period. Now, most people have understood, they understand what Reconstruction is, starting in the period after the Civil War. But then Reconstruction, all of the laws, it was struck down, marked as unconstitutional. It's after that that most people are not familiar with the terminology of the redemption period, where rights and equality leading all the way up to the Jim Crow era in the early 20th century, they were constantly taken away. Disenfranchisement. You see this in the works of Benjamin Elijah Mays. The vote was taken away. This is a period that is generally understood. You saw the increase of lynching. This is the onset of the Jim Crow era. This is the period that most people are unfamiliar with, but it's called the redemption period, where whiteness or white supremacy redeems its dominance. Why do I say I fear that we may be entering a period like that? There are three observations that I make in the 20th century and I'm seeing now from a psychosocial perspective today. First, we saw in the late 1900s, early 20th century, it's what I call the reconstruction of collective memory. And so there was an effort to basically say slavery was not really slavery. It was something else. It was cooperation between people. Frederick Douglass knew that this would be a problem. We see this, and even to his death, he knew it was coming, and not a decade after his death, we see this revisionist history, especially in the creation of the Lost Cause. And the Lost Cause was a racialized narrative and fantasy about the reasons for the Civil War. And a lot of these reasons came out of the Daughters of Confederacy, was fine-tuned by Thomas Dixon's novel, The Klansman. And then it was popularized by D.W. Griffith's movie, The Birth of a Nation. And when D.W. Griffith made this movie, President Woodrow Wilson screened it in the White House. So you have this reconstruction, this attempted reconstruction of collective memory. How do I relate that to today? A lot of people are unaware. In January of this year, you have this 1776 report that was published that was basically an effort. It was a presidential commission. It was an effort for scholars to come together to rethink or to re-narrate American history to something that is what I refer to as a more romanticized version of our innocence, our greatness, something that's more in line with the whole concept of manifest destiny and divine election, that we were elected by God, and to really prop up this notion of innocence and greatness in America. So there's this reconstruction of collective history that we saw. Secondly, we are underestimating or choosing not to think about what happened on January 6th. On January 6th, that was not the first time it happened. We see this happen in 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina, and there was a race riot where rioters overthrew the local government. And the only difference between what happened in Wilmington, North Carolina, and January 6th is that in Wilmington, North Carolina, they were successful. They overthrew the local government. And it stemmed out of a local Black newspaper that dared to challenge the lies that were being told about the purpose of lynching Black men, and that how Black men were rapists and they were raping white women. What's amazing about this is that it was not until May 31st of 2006 that Wilmington, North Carolina actually commissioned a report and conceded what happened in this race riot and how the local government was overrun by members of the KKK, other white nationalists, white supremacists. It was only until then that they issued a report. Why do I bring this up? From a psycho-historical perspective, we are playing a very, very dangerous game when we are indifferent to what we saw on January 6th. This is very dangerous. We have been here before, and we underestimate our potential for what could happen. And the last thing we see in this redemption period was simply disenfranchisement, taking the Black vote away across the entire South. And this is what we're seeing now, even as of March 24th this year. 361 bills introduced with restrictive provisions in 47 states. So I look at several personalities in this work: Martin Luther King, Benjamin Elijah Mays, Ida B. Wells, Frederick Douglass, and Fannie Lou Hamer. And I come up with themes where I'm attempting to create a clinical picture and a spiritual picture of how we can reimagine praxis based on the lives that they lived. Quickly, with Martin Luther King, the theme I'm coming up is with finding your courage. We saw that with Martin Luther King, he had to come to terms with his calling would more than likely result in self-injury. And what do we understand in terms of that? In terms of Christian praxis, you cannot do this work today and expect to remain comfortable. So with Martin Luther King, I talk about finding your courage. With Benjamin Elijah Mays, I talk about doing your work. What is your life's project? Your life's project, not going to work. I'm not talking about your place of employment. I'm not talking about your vocation. With Benjamin Elijah Mays, he ultimately discovered that being the president of Morehouse was his work. And when you find your life's project, how can you know what your life's project is? Here's a clue. What is it that you have, what is it that you are drawn to, or what is it that you are doing where you don't know how to stop doing it. The only way you can be stopped is if somehow you lost your life or if someone tried to restrain you. We see in Benjamin Elijah Mays that his work at Morehouse was inseparable. His life's project there was inseparable from how he understood his Christian faith. With Ida B. Wells, the practice of truth-telling. She didn't concede to the public myth that it was because of rape that lynching was justified. She actually, and I don't think Ida B. Wells gets a lot of credit for this, she laid a lot of groundwork for how sociology is done today, where she did research as her basis, quantitative and qualitative research to make the argument or to dispel the myth of how lynching was justified and really to point to how this was a form of radical evil. In Frederick Douglass, we see that he rejected identity politics. He refused to cooperate with the imagination that was provided by the racial imagination. Frederick Douglass, to his dying day, insisted on being his authentic self, his true self. And lastly, with Fannie Lou Hamer, I talk about this concept of disruptive empathy. We see that in, this is a term that's coined, I believe, initially by a Catholic philosopher, Girard. We also see where this is used, I forget her name, in her work on bystanders, when she's talking about the work of the church and others during the Holocaust. But in the life of Fannie Lou Hamer, we see what I call disruptive empathy, or what I refer to as disruptive empathy, but also transgressive love. Fannie Lou Hamer loved the community that she was in. She loved those who were downtrodden. In her life, we see that she got involved knowing that the payoff, that the cost would be harm. There's an episode where she is arrested one night. A lot of people don't like to talk about it. She spent several hours, she spent a night in prison. And I have to believe Fannie Lou Hamer knew that it would be a rough night for her. And in spite of that, she continued to push for voting rights, both at the local level in Mississippi, taking this all the way to the national level. So I talk about these individuals and how can we emulate them in a way to talk about our current situation. I'll begin to wrap this up here as our time is spent. What is a path forward? How do we understand hope? We understand hope by looking at the ancestors, by looking at the cloud of witnesses, understanding we have been here before, and our hope is knowing that we have glimpses. When I look at, again, last year, I look at how this millennial, and I know it just wasn't millennials, but this millennial generation from all races, all creeds, all colors, they come together. That is a glimpse of who we are at our best. That is a glimpse of what the church could be at its best. When we look at these figures that in this project I am calling the Titans, Fannie Lou Hamer, Frederick Douglass, we see glimpses of human practices of what we can be at our best. But I'm also calling here for, just as we saw in what we are referring to, this romanticized era of the civil rights movement, as if it was easier to do then than it is to do now. People moved at a grassroots level. What does this mean? If you look at the apocalyptic literature, when we talk about apocalypse, all we're talking about is an unveiling, a revelation. Something has been revealed that we did not know was there. something was revealed to us in January that we've been deluding ourselves to. And when you look at Matthew, when you look at, towards the end of Matthew, you look at the 24th chapter, the 25th, and Jesus is talking about, the end times, the eschaton. You'll notice there's a passage in there where he talks about how there will be disruption in families, mothers and daughters in dispute, sons, fathers. I believe this is what we're going to have to see today. You cannot do the work of the ministry and remain comfortable.
So somebody got a grant and asked him if he would do this.
Is that a question?
Like, why would he say no to that, right?
No.
Is that a question?
No, that was an unmute. Go for it, continue.
Okay. We cannot do the work of ministry and remain comfortable or do it in a way where we try to evade being harmed, evade being disliked. This has to be done at a ground level by a massive amount of people, by a multiplicity of individuals. And I believe that if we can re-envision theological praxis in a way that we've seen in these historical figures, we have a way forward to move with this where we are right now. So I'll take a pause right there. I'll stop right there, Dr. Ward, and invite any other questions.
So I'm going to ask one other question from the chat. And as I'm asking this question and Dr. Gibson is answering, if you would like to ask him a question by unmuting yourself, if you could just raise your hand by using the little raise hand function, and then I'll call on you. So Dr. Gibson, one of the other questions asked in the chat was about this connection between social justice and also around capitalism. And so the question is it even possible for us to seek justice when this country is founded on capitalism?
I think that's a very, that's a complex question, right? Capitalism is complex. I mean, to some extent, it's just how we understand it. It's a medium of trade based on value and interest. I mean, the bottom line is a lot of the schools are Calvin, Niagara, they have endowments, they have investments, things of that nature. There are systems of trade and how people can raise money, how, interest, things of that nature. I think it's more about where it becomes problematic are the assumptions behind capitalism. And for instance, that there has to be a zero-sum game, that in any transaction, there's going to be a winner and a loser. That someone has to, of maximizing efficiency. And so when you talk about maximizing shareholder wealth, I can do that possibly if I lay off 2,000 people. Am I going to maximize my wealth? Possibly. But do I have to lay off 2,000 people in order to remain rich? And so when you think of capitalism, it's more about the values and it's really the value that we place on human life that corrupts capitalism, where you are valued based on how much you produce, how productive you are, how efficient you are. And it becomes very dangerous when we then sacralize those assumptions. I think this is why scripture says it's very difficult for a rich man to enter, or a rich person to enter the kingdom, because it's very easy for me to think that my riches in the temporal realm reflects God's affirmation of my life and what I'm doing. And they can be diametrically opposed.
I'm waiting for folks to let us know that they want to ask you your question. But while we're waiting, I have a question for you. Based upon these themes that you've pulled out from these historic writers, do you think that these are intrinsic qualities or are these learned qualities?
I'm going to combine them both and say they are qualities that have to be practiced. So I'm talking now as that's my psychotherapist, as a psychotherapist. These are capacities. And so, for instance, when I talk about Martin Luther King, I didn't say, as an example, I'm going to talk about courage. I'm going to talk about how do you find your courage? Because that's the struggle all of us have. How do we find our courage to do or say something that I know will put me at odds with a community of affirmation? How do I find my courage when I know this particular call of God on my life may result in some form of my demise? He had to work on that. And as I discussed, I believe it started, if you've ever been to his house at Dexter, his parsonage in Montgomery, not Montgomery, I'm sorry, I think it's Salem. But if you've ever been to his first parsonage and you see the kitchen where he talks about in his autobiography, the kitchen moment, and you go in the house, you see they actually had a bomb door they had to build to protect from being bombed. And he talks about it was that moment, I think he says he dropped some of the dishes and he was terrified. And he basically had to disclose to God how terrified he was. And he called for God's strength. I believe his road to finding his courage began there. And I really don't think we see any finality to it until the night before he was assassinated, his last sermon at Mason Temple. He had to find it. Fannie Lou Hamer, Ida B. Wells in Memphis, her plant, her newspaper press burned down. One of her best friends was killed in a racial massacre. In her autobiography, it talks about how she lost her strength at that news. She had to practice truth telling. This is where we have to go as a people of faith. You have to practice this, and then you have to engage one-on-one, nitty-gritty discipleship in your own communities, whether we're in the private sector or in the seminary. I was a banker. I'm talking about vice president talking to vice president, seminary president talking to seminary president. When do we say, you know what? You can do better. Yes, I know that school. I'm not the president of that school, but you know what? We're friends on the golf course. I heard you say something. I heard you do something. That's the nitty-gritty discipleship we need. Full professor to full professor, associate professor to associate professor. I've been hearing this. Yes, I know I don't teach this, but there's some troubling things. This is reflective of the grass movement that we saw in the civil rights era. That's where this has to go.
Sharon, please unmute yourself and ask Dr. Gibson your question.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Gibson.
Hi, Sharon.
Earlier on, you said looking to our ancestors and those who worked in the civil rights movement can help lead us out of this time. Given that white supremacy continues to morph and respond and change to activism, what does it mean to get out of, and have we ever been out of?
See, and thank you for that question. This is why I'm making the argument. Whether we're talking about racism, white supremacy, it is a form of hatred. Until we have to bring the talk of race from sitting outside of the historical moment and bring it into history. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, we see in the First Testament, Cain kills his brother. I believe that's metaphor to show over something as simple as offerings to God, how hate and murder is so resident and present in the human experience. Then in the Second Testament, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is talking about, okay, even if you hate your brother or sister without a cause, even if you do that, you're already committing murder. Jesus is showing how this is resident in us. I think there's a lot of scapegoating to the people we see on TV, but the technology for that sort of racial hatred, it is in all of us. It is in our churches. It is in those who are preaching. So my argument is, if we look at this not as in our traditional talk, it is hubris to talk about this in a way to say, when can we get past racism? That's been part of the problem, how we talk about it. It's a form of human hatred. Now, what are the practices in the church that we always have to continue to keep that level repressed as much as possible? It doesn't go away. How do we subjugate it as much as possible? I like the way Coretta Scott King says it after the death of her husband. She says, freedom has to be won in every generation, every. That's the problem I have with the talk of reconciliation. When we talk about, let's get to this destination where we can talk about it no more. I just think that's theologically and biblically bankrupt.
I'm going to ask Jante to unmute herself and to ask her question, please.
How do you know I had a question? No. Is it a specific question in the chat, or are you saying like a question that I have?
The question you wrote in your chat.
Okay, I'm sorry. Give me 1 second to find it. So I know I put in the chat, I said, we talk about this idea that Black Lives Matter is hip or trendy to some people. So what do you think can and should be done to get people to start taking the Black Lives Matter movement more seriously? But I actually, oh, I'm sorry. You're talking about the Asian hate one. I'm sorry. Okay. So I said some people are responding and reacting to the Asian hate crime bill that was passed in the Senate recently in response to the recent acts of terrorism in the Asian community. So my question is, what do you think about the government's varying responses to the Black and Asian communities and society's response to the way things that were handled? So some people are upset about the fact that there was an Asian hate crime bill passed because Black Lives Matter feels like they haven't been getting enough, I guess, attention.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think I have a couple of reactions. I'm glad the bill is there. It's needed. We've never been able to pass a federal anti-lynching bill, but I think that's diagnostic. And I remember being at a conference one time and I was listening to the late James Cone, and he said this one thing that has always stuck with me. A lot of times he said this: no matter how we talk about race, Black and white people, because of our history in this country, we are going to always be tied together at the hip. There is something peculiar about the slavocracy and our history that we have not dealt with. The end of the Civil War was nothing of a reconciliation. The church had nothing to do with it. So all we have done, if I can speak psychodynamically as a psychotherapist, we have passed down maladaptive behavior intergenerationally. And so there's, even as I describe in this project, I said we have to rethink about how we even understand the concept of racism. And I talk about it, it's a socialization of a way of experiencing another person, where your skin tone becomes the marker of implicit domination, of subjugating you. I think in that there is a history of Black and white people that we continue to ignore, that we continue to romanticize, that we continue to say, let's not talk about any of this. Let's not talk about how racial hatred has corrupted the soul. Let's just do everything we can to remove the tension. There are a lot of ways you can remove cognitive dissonance. And as a result, we continue to operate in maladaptive ways, one of which is, I think, an example is what you are bringing up. And that is the ease with which we may be able to talk about other forms of oppression in other groups. But when we talk about Black and white relations, it becomes a source of animosity. It can be a source of bitterness, gaslighting, rage. Why don't you just get over it? As a pastoral theologian, I am arguing that is diagnostic of intergenerational maladaptive behavior that I believe we still have the power in the church to correct in the community, but we just have to have the courage to do it. We have to find that courage to go there. January 6th was not an anomaly. We are foolhardy to believe that January 6th was an anomaly. January 6th was a symptom of what we continue to ignore. And I fear the next time we have history where they were successful, the next time the cavalry may not be able to come in to save lives. We have to address this.
And on that note, we'll just say thank you so much, Dr. Gibson. You were so powerful, and I think that everyone can take away many pieces of nuggets here to take back to their congregations or to the communities with which they are working. We hope to welcome you to Niagara once this pandemic is behind us, which reminds me, if you haven't gotten vaccinated, people, please consider it.
I'm vaccinated.
Me too. So, my hope is that you will come to Niagara in the near future so that we can see you face to face and to welcome you to our beautiful campus. Everyone, thank you so much for your time today. We will send out the recordings next week. We will send a link to where you can find them. And if there were any unanswered questions in the chat, I'm gonna bounce them to Dr. Gibson and ask him to give a little answer for us, and we will send those answers out to you as well. May you guys be blessed by God and kept safe in his care. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.